In 1841, the Whitlow Orphanage opened its gates under a sky so clean it seemed painted. The gate itself was white, heavy, and lacquered smooth, polished until the sun caught on it like a blade. Local papers described it as a beacon of mercy, a sanctuary for the forgotten. Children in muted linen uniforms stood in perfect lines for the visiting photographers, though most of those images would never surface. The Whitlow family, dressed in ivory and pearl, posed just behind the children. Lady Emmeline Whitlow kept one gloved hand on a young girl's shoulder and the other over her heart, as though she were holding the moment in place. Her husband, Robert, had already stepped away to speak with members of Parliament, promising innovation in care, transparency in records, and spiritual reform rooted in faith. They were praised not just for their generosity but their efficiency. The Whitlows claimed that their methods reduced childhood trauma, that none of their orphans ever went hungry, and that their graduation rate was unmatched. But when pressed, no one could name a single orphan who had left. Not one. From the outside, the orphanage was serene. Rows of white fencing ringed the property, where lilacs and trimmed hedges softened the edges of the stone buildings. The hedges were never allowed to grow beyond a certain height, and neither, it seemed, were the children. Reports from local tailors showed monthly orders for uniforms, but the sizes rarely changed. The same measurements were repeated for years. A boy named Thomas appeared in the ledgers from 1842 to 1848. Same height, same waist, same shoe. A girl named Elsie, listed in the same handwriting, was always 11. Always. Staff turnover was explained away as natural. The Whitlows insisted on a strict code of conduct, and many simply couldn't keep pace with the spiritual demands of the program. It was a phrase often repeated in dismissal letters. Incompatible with the doctrine of softness. Those words never raised alarm. Not then. Even Queen Victoria herself sent an embroidered handkerchief and a personal letter commending the family for lifting the veil of suffering from those who would otherwise rot in the alleys of Kent. The royal seal sat above a generous endowment, and the Whitlows hung the letter in a gold frame beside the chapel. Below it, a carved plaque bore the words, "Only the blank can be filled." No one asked what it meant. The Whitlow name was too clean, their intentions too clear. Reporters wrote of laughter behind the hedges and spoke of Emmeline's gentle voice drifting down the halls at dusk, reading scripture and fairy tales to those under her care. They did not report the curious stillness of the children, how they rarely looked up when spoken to, or how visitors were only allowed in certain rooms at certain hours under the watchful eyes of selected chaperones. On paper, the orphanage thrived. Donor receipts flowed in from churches, nobles, even scientists who supported the wholesome blank slate method the Whitlows had patented. But in town, behind closed doors, people whispered. No one had seen an orphan leave, not by foot, not by carriage, not even by coffin. The graveyard behind the chapel had only one stone, a carved lamb with no name. Parents who had relinquished their children out of poverty or shame were told never to return, for it might disturb the process. And so they didn't. There was no protest, only time. And with time, forgetfulness. When one former maid asked after a child she had once brushed hair for, she was told she had misremembered. That there had never been a child by that name. That names, like pain, were best erased. By 1845, the Whitlows were invited to speak at conferences in London. Emmeline, now styling herself as a spiritual reformer, spoke of divine purity and the dangers of premature identity. Her papers were distributed to educational reform boards and printed in medical journals under a pseudonym. She claimed that childhood could be perfected if one removed the self before it settled. She spoke in soft tones about silence as medicine, sameness as safety. At home, the orphanage mirrored her vision. The children wore identical clothes, ate identical meals, walked in mirrored rhythms. And yet their numbers never changed. Inspectors noticed but said nothing. They were greeted with tea, warmth, and a sense of being watched in a way that made them feel too embarrassed to question. One inspector even noted in his report that the air felt too clean and quickly crossed it out. Photographs began to fade, paperwork smudged, names disappeared. No one knew where the older children went. There were no apprenticeships, no graduation ceremonies, no records of relocation. Just more children. Always more, always small, always quiet. Some suspected new ones were being brought in. But the gate was only opened from within and the walls were too high to peer over. Local children learned to walk on the opposite side of the road. Not from fear, but from confusion. The kind that lives beneath the skin that has no name but makes the stomach twist. One boy said the white paint made his eyes hurt. Another girl claimed she saw the same child twice in one day, wearing the same dress, standing in different windows. Her mother slapped her and told her not to lie. The truth was not violent, not yet. It was something worse. It was soft, sterile, and righteous. A lie wrapped in lavender and scripture, whispered through keyholes and held in place by gold-framed praise. And beneath it all, a silence that grew heavier with each passing season. In the summer of 1846, the gate was repainted, the same shade of white, but this time with a thicker gloss. One local man swore he smelled iron in the air. Another said the wood beneath the paint wasn't wood anymore. But they did not investigate. They did not want to know. By then, knowing had become dangerous. The Whitlows smiled for the town paper that August. The caption read, "Children of Light, 5 years of grace." In the image, Emmeline held a child close. Her expression was calm, eyes empty, the girl's face pressed into her shoulder, too tightly to see if she was breathing. And behind them, the painted gate stood tall, closed. Always closed. What no one noticed was the foundation quietly being poured beneath the cellar that same week. A hidden room, meant never to burn. Not even fire would erase what came next. By the winter of 1842, Lady Emmeline Whitlow was no longer simply a benefactor. She was a phenomenon. Her presence at court functions brought applause before she even spoke. Dressed in modest ivory lace with no jewelry but a single gold locket said to contain the hair of a departed child, she stood before dukes and doctors and spoke not of suffering but of order. She called it a higher mercy, the removal of chaos from the child soul. Aging, she claimed, was not just a process of the body but the visible failure of the mind to remain obedient. Her speeches were gentle, even sorrowful. She said the world rushed children toward identity like a cruel wind, stripping them of peace. She offered stillness instead, a way to protect the child from the self. Applause followed her everywhere. What no one knew was that behind the whitewashed walls of the orphanage, she had already begun the ritual she now named character flattening. Inside the orphanage, the clocks were slowed by design. Meals were thinned out to nearly translucent gruel. Names were reduced to initials, then replaced altogether. The children were not punished for disobedience. They were simply removed from the timetable, placed in solitary white rooms where they were told to breathe until the urge to speak or question passed. Fasting became a tool of faith. Silence, the highest discipline. Staff were instructed to hold their voices just below a whisper, to walk only in parallel to the children, never directly toward them, never making eye contact longer than 3 seconds. Beds were made and unmade every 4 hours, even during sleep, to prevent the children from forming attachments to one position, one side, oneself. Emmeline called it soft rotation, the constant, imperceptible remolding of the human clay before it hardened. Her journals, now sealed in the British Library under restricted access, detail the spiritual logic beneath the regimen. She wrote that children, unlike adults, are capable of becoming unblemished vessels. If stripped of memory, name, and physical selfhood before the age of maturity. She believed memory was a stain, that personality was a wound, that the only way to save a soul was to interrupt its shape before it formed. Every birthday was ignored. Mirrors were banned. The only stories read aloud were ones that ended in silence. Tales with no ending or characters who vanished. She said closure was violence because it planted the seed of self. Outside, her words won her sainthood. Even Queen Victoria sent handwritten notes of gratitude, once referring to the Whitlow method as divine in its simplicity. Wealthy patrons from across the empire began to send their own children for temperance retreats. They stayed for a week, maybe 2, and always returned thinner, quieter, their eyes soft and vacant. They were described as deepened, as if they had been lowered into some holy pool and risen half erased. Some families asked to extend their children's stay. A few never returned to collect them. The paperwork was easy. The Whitlows kept excellent files, or so it appeared. Emmeline hosted dinners at the orphanage, carefully curated evenings where choirs of children recited scripture in a flat, melodic tone. Guests were enchanted by their posture, their discipline, their harmony. No one noticed the absence of laughter, of eye movement, of age gaps. All children appeared to be between 8 and 11. When questioned, Emmeline simply said that maturity had been postponed as an act of grace. And people believed her. Because believing otherwise meant questioning the clean linens, the lavender-scented halls, the calm tone of a woman who only ever spoke in kindness. There was no violence, not then. Nothing you could point to with a shaking hand. Only absence. One of the earliest records of internal protest came from a young governess named Miriam Holt, assigned to the dormitory in the South Wing. Her private notes, recovered long after her disappearance, describe rounds performed at midnight, not by staff, but by the children themselves. She heard footsteps move in perfect rhythm across the tiled floor, the sound of bowls being passed and the faint rustle of cloth, as if garments were being exchanged between bodies of the same size. She described a boy who had a small scar on his hand one day and the next, nothing. She claimed he greeted her twice with the same phrase, the same tone, 4 days apart, as if replaying a scene he did not know he had already lived. She wrote of a girl who sat too still, whose pupils did not shrink when the morning sun hit her face. Her final entry read, "They are not learning. They are erasing, and I am beginning to forget them as soon as I leave the room. The following week, Miriam was transferred, no forwarding address. Her letters to family stopped. Her file was marked incompatible with doctrine. By 1844, the Whitlow method was being cited in lectures at Oxford. Emmeline's essays were published under the title The Cradle of Stillness. In it, she warned of the dangers of premature selfhood and argued for the soft retention of youth through what she called soul-stilling environments. She included sketches of dormitory layouts, dietary charts for cognitive dulling, and behavioral milestones for identifying pre-ego signs. It was all framed in care, the kind that speaks of gentleness while applying pressure just beneath the skin. Visitors continued to tour the orphanage. They were ushered into painted parlors, shown selected rooms, served herbal tea in thin porcelain cups. And always Emmeline smiled, her voice low and steady, as if speaking to someone already asleep. And always the children followed in unison, hands folded, eyes blank, shoes silent on the floor. It was beautiful in a way that made the mind shut down. And still none of them aged. The banquet invitations kept arriving. The praise kept rising. But the regimen grew harsher. In the attic, a new room was being prepared, not for sleeping, but for silence. A room where children went in with names and came out without them. Where the next phase of stillness would begin. One that required them to stay still even when they weren't breathing. By the spring of 1847, the Whitlow Orphanage was no longer spoken of in Kent with pride, but with a kind of reverent unease. Too polished, too perfect. The children were always clean, always still, no tantrums, no injuries, no scrawled initials in corners of windows. It was as if they had never been born at all, only manufactured in the rooms themselves like dolls arranged for visitors. Yet the visitor log showed a growing list of doctors, priests, and foreign observers, each signing the registry with praise. And yet none returned a second time. No one questioned this. The Whitlows had a new project underway. They called it a nutritional evolution. But it was never spoken of publicly. It was only in the basement kitchens in the thickened hush of dawn that the true work began. Dr. Cecil Whitlow, the only son of Emmeline and Robert, had returned from the continent 2 years earlier. Trained in chemistry and what he called behavioral alchemy. He was known for speaking with precision and blinking too little. He rarely joined the family for photographs. Most assumed he was shy. The truth was far more constructed. He was their engineer. It was Cecil who introduced the formula. In his own words, written in the margins of a single surviving notebook, he sought to suppress the basal urges of identity through liquid intake. He called it the temperance serum, though those inside the orphanage referred to it in whispers as red milk. Delivered each morning in pewter pitchers, the children were required to finish it before speaking, if they were allowed to speak at all. It looked like milk, but carried a pink hue, a strange thickness that resisted the lip of the cup. Some said it smelled faintly metallic. One dismissed maid, a girl named Honor Winsley, wrote in a letter home that the fluid stuck to the cup even after scrubbing, that the children's breath changed after drinking it. She claimed they moved slower, blinked less, and sometimes stood for hours as if unsure they had bodies at all. She told her sister that one boy refused the milk 3 times and by the 4th day he wasn't seen again. She asked if children could dissolve. The letter was found torn in half in her dresser drawer 2 weeks after she disappeared. Her exit was listed as voluntary. No wages were paid, no forwarding information given. The Whitlows stated she had gone north for another opportunity, but no such place existed. Her name vanished from the registry within a month. The other maids were instructed to sign updated contracts, new gag orders written by Cecil himself, forbidding any mention of internal formulations, dietary structures, or bodily alterations observed under the care system. Some refused and were removed. Others signed with shaking hands and lowered eyes. Some began sleeping with rosaries beneath their pillows. A few stopped speaking altogether. Cecil claimed the serum was derived from harmless minerals and herbs, but the patent listed untraceable compounds and symbols rather than ingredients. The only consistent term was softening agents. In one archived medical file, he wrote that the serum relaxes the spiritual membrane, allowing for external stimuli to imprint more easily upon the child's interior structure. He did not define what the spiritual membrane was, but soon after its introduction, teachers began reporting that children no longer reacted to light pain, that they forgot questions halfway through asking them, that they stood closer to walls and farther from mirrors. When asked to write their names, some wrote only shapes. One wrote the letter A over and over again until her fingers bled. When asked what she was spelling, she said nothing. Her voice was monotone. Her face bore no expression. Local physicians were denied access to the orphanage when they inquired about unusual rashes and bone stiffness in former visiting children. The Whitlows claimed that all medical oversight was conducted by licensed in-house experts. Dr. Cecil was listed as the chief resident examiner. His signature, always in red ink, marked every chart with the words, "Condition, stable, temperance progressing." When a question was raised in Parliament regarding the orphanage's nutritional program, it was quickly silenced by the Marquess of Cambridge, who had recently received a donation for a new hospital wing. The matter was closed. The Queen remained silent. Staff turnover accelerated. Every 3 months the staff were rotated. Some claimed it was to prevent emotional bonds from forming. Others believed it was to hide patterns. No one stayed long enough to learn too much. One former laundress later confessed on her deathbed that the children's nightgowns often came back damp, but not from sweat or urine. She said the cloth carried a heaviness, as if the fabric itself was mourning. She remembered holding a shirt once too small for any child, yet labeled Phase 3. When she asked what that meant, the head matron dismissed her. 3 days later, she was reassigned to the stables. She never spoke of the orphanage again. The serum, meanwhile, was praised in scientific circles, though no samples were shared. A paper was published under Cecil's name in a Viennese journal discussing the chemical interruption of ego formulation. No copies were translated. The orphanage expanded its north wing that year, adding another dormitory. Each room was painted the same shade of muted blue, the windows so narrow they only allowed in fragmented light. The children inside were said to sleep 12 hours a night and wake without dreams. They blinked, they breathed, but they did not age. Some believed they were being preserved. Others believed they were being emptied. And still the red milk poured each morning, measured to the ounce, warmed to body temperature. No child was excused. A thin film would rise if left untouched for too long. Sometimes it shimmered, sometimes it pulsed, but it was always consumed. By year's end, the patent was officially registered with the British Office of Industrial Chemistry, under the title Whitlow Temperance Compound Number, PONCH. Its stated purpose: stabilization of cognitive flux in dependent minors. No side effects noted, no testing bodies required. The formula remained secret, and somewhere deep below the kitchen, behind a locked door where no staff were permitted, rows of vials were arranged on silver trays. Some were still warm. One had a child's fingerprint on the rim. Soon the doctrine would shift again. The attic would open, the resets would begin. But all of it started here, with a formula meant to silence the soul, one swallow at a time. In the autumn of 1848, a government inspector named Edmund Hale arrived at Whitlow Orphanage under quiet instruction. He was not a man easily rattled, slow to speak, colder still in opinion, having visited workhouses and plague hospitals across the country. But when he stepped through the painted gates and into the halls of the Whitlow institution, something pressed against him that he could not name. The children were too quiet, their bodies too still. They did not appear sick, but rather dimmed, like lamps burning on the last of their oil. Their skin held the waxy pallor of candle wax. Their uniforms were spotless, but their faces betrayed no joy, no fear, not even curiosity. They stood as they were placed and moved only when instructed. To Edmund, they looked less like children and more like shadows of them, made to fit a mold someone else had designed. His visit was unannounced, but even so, the orphanage was perfectly prepared. Lessons were underway, tables scrubbed, windows open to let in the light. Yet as he walked from one room to the next, Edmund began to notice a sameness that unnerved him. Each classroom held exactly 12 children, always 6 boys and 6 girls. The seating pattern never varied. The handwriting in the copybooks, identical line for line, even across age groups. It was the handwriting that caught his attention first. A girl named Harriet had copied a passage from Scripture. "Blessed are the meek," in smooth looping strokes. 3 rooms later, another girl named Elsie had written the same phrase in the exact same loops. On the line below, the ink had pooled in the very same place on the letter M. He asked the headmistress if the children shared notebooks. She said no. He asked to see the older children. She hesitated, then claimed that the oldest group was away on retreat. He returned the next day. The same children were in the same seats, writing the same words. He checked a record for a boy named Robert T. His school reports, supposedly handwritten by 3 different teachers over 3 years, bore no change in tone, length, or subject. Robert had studied the same lesson on moral instruction for 36 consecutive months. His name was always followed by the note, "Compliant, still improving." Edmund flipped the page. The ink changed slightly, but the words did not. No mention of growth, no mention of struggle, no mention of age. When he asked to speak to Robert, he was told the boy was in restorative reflection. When asked what that meant, the staff member smiled too softly and said it was part of the doctrine. In a side room labeled Observation Wing, Edmund was shown more notebooks, each labeled with dates and names. But all the entries, regardless of year or author, appeared to be written in one hand. He lifted a math book marked 1846. The child's name was Clara J. He opened a different book dated 1848. The same name. The answers were identical, the spacing unchanged. Even the doodles in the margin, simple circles and spirals, were repeated, not copied, repeated as if time had never moved. He leaned forward and pressed his thumb to the corner of the page. The paper was thin, too thin. It crinkled like tissue and had the faint smell of vinegar and soap. He looked at the edge, too uniform, no aging at the fold. The ink did not bleed. It sat on the surface as though afraid to sink. Later, while waiting alone in the library, Edmund stepped away from the fire and toward a loose floorboard near the shelves. A pale mark caught his eye, something carved crudely in the wood. He knelt, brushed the dust aside, and read the words. "We are made again." The letters were shallow, the edges jagged, carved by a child's hand or something just as desperate. There were no initials, no date, just the phrase. Part prayer, part warning. Before he could look closer, a staff member entered and announced tea was ready. The floorboard was replaced. The words were never mentioned again. That evening, Edmund recorded his findings in a private notebook. He described the children as emotionally muted, the records as repetitive to the point of impossibility, and the atmosphere as wholly removed from time. He intended to file a report with the Home Office, but that report was never delivered. On the train ride back to London, Edmund's case was stolen. Witnesses described a pale young man sitting near him, a boy in a school uniform, alone, eyes too wide. Edmund claimed not to remember speaking to him. That boy was never found, and Edmund's case was never recovered. In later years, those who studied Edmund's surviving notes began to question the phrase he found on the floorboard. "We are made again." Some believed it to be metaphorical, a sign of religious indoctrination or emotional cleansing. Others saw it for what it was: a pattern, a system, a cycle of unmaking and remaking that preserved the shell while erasing what once filled it, a quiet, ritualized return to zero. The notebooks were eventually transferred to the Whitlow family archive and sealed. Researchers who requested access were denied on the basis of incomplete preservation and potential misinterpretation. The handwriting samples remain classified. The children in the photos, those few that exist, still look the same. Eyes dull, faces soft, never changing. And in the south wing, near the floor where Edmund once knelt, the board has since been replaced. But beneath it the words remain. A message left behind by someone who once remembered how to write. Before the next lesson was assigned. Before the paper child forgot their name. They called them attic days, but never aloud. Only in whispers passed between trembling hands during the nightly folding of linens, or written in soap-fogged mirrors and wiped away just as fast. No calendar marked them, no bell rang. The staff never spoke of them in meetings. Yet the rhythm was unmistakable. Every 12th night, just after the Last Supper, when the sky hung thick with dusk, a child would be chosen. Always from the intermediate dormitories, those who had stopped crying at night but had not yet begun asking questions. The ones who sat a little too still, who drank the red milk without protest, who no longer flinched when the doors clicked shut. The chosen child would be dressed in white, not cotton but a strange starched fabric that held its folds even when pressed to skin. They were led barefoot up the rear staircase, the one behind the chapel organ, the one with the warped third step that never creaked unless the air was damp. And then they would vanish. Decades later, a former apprentice named Ruth Everett would speak to a private commission. She was a housemaid at Whitlow between 1852 and 1854, sent by her parish to complete what they called a year of service. She was 17 when she arrived. When she left, her hair had turned gray at the temples and she refused to sleep indoors. Her account, recovered from a sealed affidavit, describes the attic as something hidden in plain sight, a place that existed in all blueprints but was never shown. Staff were told it was used for storage, and yet no deliveries ever arrived. Ruth was instructed never to go above the third floor, but on her final year she disobeyed. What she saw would remain with her until her death. She recalled that the attic smelled like rust and sugar. Sweet at first, then metallic, then sickening. It was warmer than the rest of the building, humid even in winter. The floorboards were polished but stained in irregular circles. Long rows of white garments hung from wires that never swayed. There were no beds, just narrow wooden platforms evenly spaced, each one carved with a number and a small notch where the head would rest. On one platform she saw a girl lying still. Another stood beside her, identical in height, build, and face. Ruth said both wore the same white gown, but only one was breathing. The standing girl blinked once. The one on the platform did not move. Ruth stepped closer before being pulled away by a figure in gloves. She never saw the standing girl again. She claimed that each child brought to the attic was replaced, not returned, replaced. The bed they once occupied in the dormitory would remain untouched for one night, then refilled the next morning with a child who looked the same but blinked slower, spoke less, and answered questions in short, flat tones. Their posture was better. Their smiles, rehearsed. They no longer recalled who they had shared a bed with. Ruth wrote that sometimes a child would look into a mirror and pause too long, as if trying to remember something that didn't belong to them. Then the mirror would be taken away. What happened in the attic remained unrecorded. But the children who came down from it began to show signs: small scars behind the ear, a shallow hollow at the base of the spine, a new allergy. Some flinched at bells, others avoided their own hands. All of them began to hum the same tune during meal times, a melody no one taught them in a key that matched none of the chapel songs. One night Ruth swore she heard them all hum it in unison. Not loud, not soft, but exact, as if instructed by a rhythm only they could feel. She wept behind the pantry door, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that something had been lost. Something important. Something that couldn't be named. Later, in an unused cloakroom, Ruth found a discarded gown. It was stiff with dried fluid. The hem was burned. She took it, buried it behind the stables, and tried to forget. But 2 days later, a replacement gown appeared in the laundry basket, clean, folded, marked with a name she didn't recognize, though the handwriting was hers. She left that night, walking 12 miles to the nearest parish and refusing to speak for months. When asked years later if she believed the children were killed, she shook her head. Number it was worse than that. She said they were scrubbed like ink off a slate, that something new was written over what was already there, and the original erased so cleanly even the soul forgot it had ever belonged to someone. The attic itself was sealed shut in 1865 after a leak during a storm revealed a black stain seeping through the ceiling above the chapel. The builders were told to patch it without entering. One of them later claimed the wood bled when nailed. Another refused to return for payment. The room above was locked, the staircase removed, but the processions continued. Children still vanished at dusk, still returned quiet, obedient, and slightly off, like dolls reassembled from pieces that didn't belong. Years later, a girl would carve 3 words into the back of her writing slate before being dismissed for failing her scripture test. The slate was found by a groundskeeper. The words read, "She became me." And beneath it, too faint to see unless held against flame, another sentence had been pressed deep into the wood. It said, "I remember the floor was warm." In the winter of 1851, buried beneath layers of donation records and hand-copied attendance logs, a sealed leather booklet was found in a drawer marked "Discontinued Practices, Internal Use Only." It had no author listed on the front, no publisher's stamp, and no signs of wear. The pages smelled faintly of camphor and ink, as if untouched by time. Inside, in delicate handwriting traced with almost maternal care, the title was written across the first page. The Doctrine of Reset. No further name was needed. Those who read even a sentence recognized the voice. It was Emmeline Whitlow, the same voice that calmed restless donors, that charmed bishops and softened Parliament. But in these pages, the tone was stripped of performance. Here, she wrote plainly. Here, she explained her truth. Identity, she claimed, was not sacred. It was not natural. It was not permanent. She described it as a glitch of early experience, a reflexive scar that develops in response to error. In her doctrine, the child's soul was not to be nurtured but stilled, caught in a state of pre-ego where obedience was not taught but innate. She believed that if one could reach that state, hold it, preserve it, the child could be made incorruptible. The term she used was freeze point. The manual described how to reach freeze point through a series of ritual interventions. The first was deprivation, not starvation, but calculated hunger. A body fed just enough to survive, but never enough to anchor memory. Meals were to be thinned, flavors removed, food delivered without variation or acknowledgement. The goal was not physical weakness, but emotional drift. The child would cease to form attachments to meals, mealtimes, or the voices that delivered them. Then came sensory blankness. Rooms stripped of contrast, garments without seams. Soundproof dormitories lit with cold white gas lamps that hummed too low to be heard but too loud to be ignored. Mirrors removed, names shortened, no touching, no colors, no seasons. The final stage was memory softening. Emmeline claimed that memory was the last enemy, that it was not the events themselves that poisoned the soul, but the patterns they formed in the brain. And so she devised methods to break those patterns, songs taught backwards. Timelines repeated out of order, a prayer one day, then forbidden the next. One child given kindness on a Tuesday, punished for the same behavior on Wednesday. Days without clocks, beds moved each night, names assigned, revoked, and reassigned. The child, suspended in fog, would eventually yield. She wrote that a softened mind does not resist, it absorbs. It asks no questions. It forms no self. It becomes, in her words, a receptive host. But not all children responded. Some resisted the blankness. Some clung to memories in silence. Some, she wrote, calcified prematurely. a phrase she used to describe children who formed attachments despite the rituals. For them, the next stage was initiated, reset of form. It was not clearly defined in words. Instead, the chapter consisted of anatomical diagrams, thin, almost beautiful drawings sketched in red ink on parchment lined with faint grid lines. One diagram showed a child's head, the skull open to expose nerve pathways labeled not by name but by emotion. Another showed a rib cage surrounded by numbered points of pressure. A third showed a human spine flanked by two smaller ones. A comparison chart, perhaps. But it was the final image that would later disturb even hardened historians. It bore no title, only a note in the margin that read, "The child unmade." The image depicted a childlike form, limbs elongated slightly, the face erased, smoothed as if scraped clean. The torso was open not with surgical precision, but with something more ritualistic. Instead of organs, there were shapes, rings, symbols, lines that did not connect. The surrounding text described a process of spiritual reset through disassembly of internal narrative. What exactly this meant was never clarified, but the closing passage hinted at its meaning. It read, "When a vessel resists emptiness, the vessel must be poured out by other means." The word poured was underlined 3 times. Only a few ever saw the manual before it was locked away. A copy was rumored to have been sent to a private collection in Vienna, another to a monastery in northern Spain. The original vanished sometime before 1860, likely hidden by the remaining Whitlow staff after Emmeline's public death. But its contents lingered in the rituals of the orphanage. Observers would later note how certain children vanished after what staff called mirror phase failure. Others were moved to quiet rooms in the West Wing, where they remained unseen until their records were marked complete. No explanation ever followed. Years later, one surviving child, monde if the term still applied, would be found during a raid on an abandoned Whitlow facility in Devon. She was 43, though her papers listed her as 12. She could speak, but only in reversed syllables. She wept when shown photographs of herself, but did not recognize her own reflection. When asked her name, she responded, "Reset." Just that. Over and over, no emotion, no change in tone. The doctrine of reset was never legally acknowledged. No charges brought, no trials held. But within the sealed archives of the British Home Office, one memo remains, unsigned, undated. It reads, "She believed she was healing them. She believed the soul was a wound," and below that, scratched faintly into the paper as if added by another hand, 4 smaller words. They believed her too. In the spring of 1862, during a planned expansion of the East Wing dormitories, construction workers struck a wall that did not appear on any blueprint. Behind it, they found a staircase, narrow, stone, angled downward into the earth. The men were ordered to halt and dismissed within the hour. A private Whitlow team dressed in coats far too clean for masonry arrived and sealed off the passage. But not before one of the builders, a man named James Tilby, smuggled out a single sheet. A diagram, water-stained but still legible. It showed the back of a child's skull, open delicately, nerves labeled not in Latin but in symbols and phrases. One cluster was marked noise retention. Another was circled in red and labeled corrective hum. Tilby sent the drawing to his cousin, a nurse. She returned it a week later with 3 words scrawled at the bottom, "This isn't medical." 3 years passed before that sealed stairwell was officially reopened, this time under court-ordered investigation. The records uncovered beneath the East Wing would become known as the Scalpel Choir documents. They were stored in a stone room no larger than a servant's kitchen, lined wall to wall with drawers labeled only by number. Inside were hundreds of yellowed files, each bearing the signature of Dr. Cecil Whitlow, neat, always in red ink. The contents were not reports but instructions, hand-drawn diagrams, anatomical sketches, lists of required tools. Most did not contain the names of patients. Instead, they used phrases like Specimen 11B or Cycle 2, Candidate failed. Some sheets were covered in notes, others entirely blank save for a single word at the top. Reset. The first diagram examined in full detail was titled Tongue Lineage Removal. It showed the muscle structure of a child's mouth, with small dotted lines around the base of the tongue. The purpose, according to Cecil's notes, was to sever inherited vocal rhythm, a phrase not found in any known medical literature. He believed that certain speech patterns carried identity. That tone, cadence, and instinctive sound were ancestral tethers binding the child to lineage. The goal of the procedure was to remove that tether. The instructions listed tools so fine they resembled those used for embroidery. Curved scalpels no longer than a matchstick, hooks the size of sewing pins, and a clamp designed to hold the tongue without bruising the surrounding tissue. One note read, "Remove before full sleep if resistance is present. Memory of pain accelerates flattening." Other files revealed even stranger ideas. Ocular smoothing was a procedure involving the inner muscles of the eye, not to correct vision but to soften gaze imprint. Cecil theorized that the way a child looked at the world shaped their place within it. By adjusting the muscles, he believed one could erase the sharpness of individual recognition. In his own words, the child will no longer gaze, only receive, like glass that remembers nothing. Reports of pupils dilating inconsistently or children failing to recognize even their own hands were later linked to this practice. One sketch showed a girl's eyes opened wide with small clasps, a line drawn through her irises to indicate the direction of pressure. Below it, the phrase leveling achieved, no return of self-awareness was written. But it was auditory rebirth by severance that disturbed even the most hardened examiners. It was not simply about deafness. It was about altering the way sound was processed in the brain. The inner ear was to be partially disconnected, not fully destroyed, creating what Cecil called harmonic absence. He believed that silence born of trauma was more spiritually effective than silence born of nature. The procedure involved severing select auditory nerves while preserving others, enough to still hear rhythm but not voice, enough to hum but not to understand. He called it partial silencing, a step necessary, he claimed, to retune the soul's cavity. The staff had another name for the operation. They called it singing the child flat. Notes from attendants, scribbled hastily and unsigned, mentioned children who hummed for hours after the procedure, not in distress but in pattern. One note described a boy who, after his procedure, could no longer speak but would tap out rhythms on his knees in sequences of 4, always 4. Another girl was said to sway silently in her cot, mouth slightly open as if hearing something no one else could. When asked what she was doing, she mouthed the word listening, though no sound followed. In the far drawer of the chamber, one file stood apart, bound in twine. Inside were sketches that bore no labels, only dates and symbols no one could translate. The central image showed a child lying supine, limbs marked with measurement lines, ribs numbered. Beneath the torso, a phrase was written: "If sound remains, memory returns." Another diagram showed a larynx crossed out with 3 red X's. Below it, "Voice is the final betrayal." At the bottom of the page, in fainter ink, one final note was added, almost reluctant in tone. It read, "Some songs return on their own. Burn the tongue if needed." The Whitlows never spoke of these procedures. Emmeline's public writings denied all knowledge of surgical work, but within her private journal, a single reference to flattening through softness and submission of flesh was later matched, word for word, to one of Cecil's operation notes. Whether she ordered the surgeries or merely allowed them is unknown, but the silence around them was not passive. It was deliberate, a silence enforced not by ignorance, but by design. When the chamber was resealed, some of the tools were kept for study, others were deemed too strange, too precise, and too purposeful to exist outside of what they were made for. Scalpels that sliced not to heal but to erase. Hooks that pulled not broken bones but the voice out of memory. Instruments shaped like song, used to tune the child until no sound remained, until all that was left was something blank and humming. Something that could be taught to smile again, if only for a while. In the spring of 1903, long after the Whitlow name had faded from the tongues of Parliament and polite society, a team of surveyors arrived at the old estate to mark land boundaries for a railway extension. The orphanage had been closed for over 30 years by then, its windows boarded and chapel roof collapsed from rot. What remained was overgrowth and silence. But behind the east wing, beyond the remains of a crumbling fountain, they found the garden. Not the kind blooming with roses or vegetables, but a square of level ground, shaded by 5 identical trees. Ash, each one twisted in the same direction, their bark pale as bone and leaves curling at the edges like paper scorched at the rim. The soil beneath was unnaturally still, no weeds, no worms. When one of the crew dropped a stake into the ground, the echo was hollow. It didn't strike earth. It struck something else. Excavation began within the week, first out of curiosity, then out of obligation. The first layer of dirt peeled away easily, dry and loose, as if it hadn't been watered in decades. Just beneath it, a soft white object appeared. Thin, rectangular, curled at the corners. At first they thought it was parchment, but when brushed clean, the texture revealed itself, leather. Too soft for cowhide, too pale for goat. A stitched border ran around the edge, and in the center initials were sewn in red thread. J.M., no last name, no date, just those letters trembling slightly in the uneven stitching as if sewn by hand. When they lifted it, the ground gave way. Beneath it were bones, small, child-sized, arranged in tight fetal positions but wrong somehow. The spine curled too tightly, the skull angled forward like a bow. There were no signs of growth on the long bones, no plate fusion, no wear at the joints. As if they had never aged past a single fixed moment. As if their lives had been stopped before their bodies had learned how to change. The leather slips continued to appear. One for each plot, each one white, the color of stripped memory, stitched with different initials, CT, ER, LB, all in the same red thread. all buried just inches above the bones like nameplates not meant to be seen. None matched records from public orphanage logs. But deeper in the ministry's archives, in a drawer misfiled under abandoned grants, a short list was later uncovered. Unpublished, handwritten, 26 names. Each one matched to a child supposedly adopted in the late 1850s. Their exit interviews, the final notes, were signed with Emmeline Whitlow's initials, and next to each name, in faint pencil, a phrase repeated, "Reset failed." As the plots were opened one by one, patterns emerged, each grave marked by a single rusted pin pressed vertically into the soil above the skull, almost like a placeholder. Not a nail, not a screw, something else. It resembled a tool, narrow at the top, wider at the base, the metal darkened by age but still sharp at the tip. Forensic specialists would later discover that the pins matched instruments detailed in the scalpel choir files, ones used not for surgery but for closure, a procedure meant to interrupt the final stage of emotional resistance, to ensure that the child did not dream. In a hospital bed outside London, one of the last surviving nurses from the Whitlow institution, then nearing 90, confessed without being asked. Her lungs were weak, her voice thin, but her mind frighteningly clear. When shown a photograph of the white slips, she whispered, "They were not buried. They were stored." She said the garden had once been a place of music where the children were brought to sing under the trees. But that was only the surface. She described midnight processions, children carried out in silence, always after failed resets. Their bodies placed into prepared spaces, not with grief, but with precision. She said the leather slips were made from the softest skin, back, shoulder, inner thigh, removed before cooling began, stitched while the name was still remembered, then left just below the soil to keep the identity from rising. A ritual, she called it, a sealing of the self. When asked why none of this was reported, she said it had been explained as mercy, that Emmeline believed failure to reset left the child stuck, broken between selves, unable to move forward or return. That death, in her words, was a kindness to those who could not be made new, and those who carried it out did not see themselves as executioners but gardeners, tending to the soil, planting silence. The trees, when tested, showed unusual properties. Their roots did not spread outward but downward, tightly coiled around each other in perfect spirals. The leaves, pale and stiff, contained high levels of iron and calcium. No birds nested in them. No insects stirred beneath. When one was cut, the sap was clear, cold to the touch, almost sterile. One botanist described the trees as fed by memory, starved of time. The land was never developed. The railway plans were quietly rerouted. The garden, though unmarked, was fenced with wrought iron and padlocked under the name Whitlow Historical Site. No tour signs were placed, no brochures printed. But every few years fresh flowers appear at the gate, no notes. Just white blooms always, bundled in groups of 6. Those who dig into the Whitlow legacy now often stop at the garden. They do not enter. They stand at the gate and speak nothing. Some leave with faces pale and blank. Others cry without knowing why. And somewhere deep in the archives, a final line from the nurse's confession remains sealed in a box stamped, "Private," unread except by one. The line reads, "We planted them carefully so they would not forget how still they were meant to stay." In the spring of 1946, long after the Whitlow name had been buried beneath scandal, revision, and silence, a man was found standing barefoot on the overgrown path just inside the eastern gate. The orphanage had been closed for over half a century. The roofs had collapsed. The chapel was hollowed by birds. No one had walked those paths in years, not willingly. But there he stood, still and patient, his hands folded in front of him like a schoolboy waiting for instruction. The groundskeeper who discovered him said the man smiled when spoken to, but not in recognition, in obedience. His hair was white, his skin loose with age, but the way he tilted his head, the way he held his shoulders, the way he blinked with shallow rhythm, it was the posture of a child. He was taken into custody with little resistance. In the police report, the arresting officer described the man as mentally delayed, with a vocabulary matching that of a boy no older than 10. He answered questions in short, clipped replies. When asked his name, he gave a single letter. When asked his age, he said, "Small." When asked what he was doing on the property, he looked down at his shoes and whispered, "I was good. I stayed small." He said this over and over, even when no one was speaking to him. That same phrase, like a verse too deeply memorized to forget. Doctors were brought in. He was examined, scanned, measured. His bones were old, his skin fragile. Cataracts veiled both eyes, and his teeth were worn almost flat from years of grinding. Yet his body showed none of the usual signs of adult development. He was narrow-shouldered, slight in build, his growth halted around the frame of adolescence. No tattoos, no scars, no sign of work or injury. His fingers were clean and soft, nails trimmed, hands without calluses. He slept in short intervals, never longer than 2 hours, and hummed to himself in a low, tuneless rhythm. Nurses said it resembled the sound of machinery. Predictable, mechanical, empty of melody. One nurse wept after hearing it for 3 nights in a row. She said it felt like a song meant to keep something from waking up. The DNA test was ordered as a formality. A tissue sample was taken. It was sent through national records with little hope of a match. What returned shocked everyone. The man's profile matched a file dated 1863 from the Whitlow Orphanage. The child listed was 11 years old at time of admission. The name was partial, the ink faded, but the birthmark listed on the neck, a pale crescent near the jaw, was still present on the man's skin. The entry form noted that the boy was quiet, compliant, and responded well to flattening. No exit date was recorded, only a notation in red ink, retained for extended phase alignment. The discovery made headlines for a single week before it was buried by larger news. A living remnant of the Whitlow institution, walking proof of a system once praised for its mercy and purity. But no court could try a name that no longer owned its crimes. The boy, now man, was placed in a care facility under anonymous status. He was given paper and pen. He wrote the same sentence every day. I was good. I stayed small. The handwriting never changed. Block letters, careful spacing, as if copied from a chalkboard he hadn't seen in 80 years. Over time, his body began to fail. The doctors called it delayed collapse. Organs functioning on a slowed rhythm, now decaying all at once. His heart beat irregularly, his breath shallow but even. He did not speak unless prompted. He did not cry. When asked if he remembered the garden, he nodded. When asked what he remembered, he whispered, "White coats, white dirt, white quiet." He smiled after he said it and then fell silent for the rest of the day. In his final hours, he was placed under observation. He did not ask for food. He did not request water. But every few minutes he mouthed the same 4 words. Not aloud, just the motion of them. I was good. I was good. The nurse assigned to him said that his eyes moved back and forth as if tracking something invisible, like reading from a wall no one else could see. His last breath came at 2:07 a.m., quiet and shallow. His face was still smiling. No will, no possessions. Just the folded note beside his bed. The final sheet of paper he had written on, corners bent from being held too long. The same sentence written 87 times. Not as a confession, but as a defense, a promise, a memory he'd been told to keep. After his death, the staff boxed up his clothes. Inside one pocket was a button, too small for his coat, hand-stitched with the letter W for Whitlow, for the place he had never left. Not truly. When they cleaned his bed, the sheet beneath his pillow was found pressed with faint lines, shapes scratched over and over by nail or bone. Not words, not drawings, just shapes, circles, squares, spirals, like the ones etched into the diagrams from the doctrine of reset. The body was cremated without ceremony. No family came forward, no name was added to the ashes. But the records remain. A match, a name, a timeline that should not have existed. A child who should have grown, should have aged, should have forgotten. But he didn't, because the doctrine had worked, the system had held. And in the end, he did exactly what he was told. He stayed small. In the winter of 1951, after a quiet storm of letters, hearings, and delayed reports too long buried in locked drawers, Parliament passed what it called the Institutional Transparency Act. It was not born from moral clarity but from embarrassment. The photographs of the garden had leaked. The leather slips had been catalogued by archivists who refused to sign the usual silence clauses. The last child of Whitlow had died under watch, his body shriveled into proof too stark to redact. The act was modest in language but immense in scope. It required all homes for children, orphanages, schools, retreats, to submit quarterly reports reviewed by third-party inspectors. No more internal doctrines, no more undisclosed practices, no more unlisted wings. The bill passed quietly, almost politely. There were no televised speeches, only the shaking of hands and the brushing aside of names that no one wanted to say aloud. The word Whitlow never appeared in the legislation, but it hovered behind every clause. A memorial was built that same year, not on the orphanage grounds which had long since been overgrown and gated, but in a quiet courtyard near St. George's Square. It was carved from pale limestone meant to resemble a folded blanket. At its base were the words, "To those who were softened until they vanished." There was no ceremony, no press. On its first day open, only 3 visitors came. One was a nurse who had once worked in the West Wing and hadn't spoken of it in 40 years. Another was a boy adopted from a separate home built on Whitlow's model who cried without knowing why. The third was an elderly man who said nothing, touched the stone once, then walked away. The wind that day was soft and cold, brushing the folds of the stone as if trying to lift it, as if trying to reach whatever lay beneath. The Whitlow Foundation was formally dissolved. Its properties were sold, its board disbanded. Emmeline's personal writings were sealed under royal order, and the remaining surgical instruments, The choir scalpels, the red-inked manuals, were quietly moved to the basement of a government medical archive labeled experimental materials, non-replicable. Cecil Whitlow's name was stricken from 3 academic journals. The doctrine of reset was never again spoken of in official language, but its ideas had already spread. Across the empire, dozens of homes still followed a familiar rhythm. Uniforms remained identical, meal patterns rigid, names shortened, eyes lowered, voices quieted. The Whitlow method had not died. It had only changed its shape. The words were softened, the tools hidden, but the ideas remained. That silence is safety, that sameness is discipline, that stillness is goodness. In South Africa, a missionary school adopted rotational solitude for disobedient pupils, mirroring Whitlow's soft rooms. In Canada, a northern children's retreat built sleeping quarters in spiraled patterns, echoing the unmarked design of the attic processions. In Australia, an orphanage handbook warned of ego formation at early ages, quoting nearly verbatim a passage from Emmeline's private journal. Each home insisted it had invented its methods. None mentioned where they had learned to make children disappear without a trace. And so the legacy of Whitlow did not end in fire or confession, but in replication. In institutions that learned how to polish their floors, quiet their children, and praise the dull shine of obedience. Evil by then had learned to smile. It had learned to wear pressed collars and carry prayer books. It had learned to whisper mercy while drawing plans with red ink. And the public, exhausted by war, by famine, by their own quiet compromises, let it pass. They let the doors close again, this time with softer locks. For those who still remember, the question remains: how many children were erased not by violence but by silence, not by force but by structure, not with screams but with folded hands and smiling caregivers who spoke of virtue and service and love? The truth of Whitlow was not that it was uniquely cruel. It was that it was methodical, that it disguised its rituals in cleanliness, its horrors in hymns, that it taught others how to do the same. Today the garden is still fenced, the trees still grow, the wind moves through the branches in quiet patterns. People say they hear a hum sometimes, and low, slow, almost tender, as if the ground itself remembers the children it was told to forget. The marble of the memorial collects dust. The folded shape of it now looks more like a cradle than a blanket. Fewer visitors come each year. The staff at the nearby archives rarely speak of what's buried in the basement. Some don't even know, or claim not to. So we end where we began, with silence, with the soft lie that it could never happen again, with the hope that institutions built in its image have not kept its bones beneath a fresh coat of white paint. But hope is not enough, not when evil learns to wait, not when it knows how to dress itself. So ask yourself, softly but clearly, what do you think? Could this happen again?